So today's lesson is entitled It Could Be Worse. And I was laughing because when some of you saw the title, you're like, what? What could be worse? How bad can it get? How bad? Well, it's always that way. And I want us to think about this is a story of people who are much like ourselves. And sometimes I think we might have an impression that no. Sometimes I think we might have impression that people in the Old Testament were really dissimilar to us because they couldn't walk over and turn up the heat. They couldn't walk over, flip on a light switch. They couldn't walk over, hit a remote and watch TV. Well, we couldn't do those things, 150 years ago either. So, but their lives are very similar to ours in that they're real people. They had two arms, two legs. Well, not everybody, but most people. And, they had hopes and they had dreams, but they also had desires. And sometimes those desires led them into trouble. And so the question is we're people like them, and we have hopes and we have dreams, and do our desires lead us into trouble? And so today's lesson is to look at a group of people in history and to find out how much like them we might possibly be. And then the question is what does God have to do to get our attention? As parents, many of us have children, and you tell your child, Johnny, Susie, hey, you need to do this. And then you ask them, do you hear me? And they say, well, I kind of heard the words coming out of your mouth, but I'm not sure I really understand the intent of what you're saying. Or maybe I don't care about the intent of what you're saying at the moment, or whatever it is. And so things happen and they don't get around to doing what you've asked them to do. And you're like, well, what happened? Why is this? So how do I get your attention to make sure these things don't happen again? And this is the same plight that God has with us. If you think about the Bible, it's full of reminders. Hey, remember this. Hey, remember that. And why does he have to say it so many times? Because you should be able to just remember that God brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand. Okay. Well, why does he have to say it so many times? Well, because we're people and we forget. If you really ask yourself this, ask yourself, why do we partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week? 52 times a year we get up here and we do this. Why do we do it? Why can't we do it once a year and remember? Because we won't. Even in the Old Testament, they had to read the whole law ever so often just so people will remember. We tend to forget. And because we tend to forget, we sometimes forget as we're going along in life and everything is happening routinely day to day that things could be a whole lot worse. So, give you a summary of what these people were. They were the children of Israel, and they were in captivity for over 400 years. So, if you were reading in Exodus 12, verses 40 through 41, it says, at that time, the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So they're captives for over 400 years. They're isolated. In Genesis 46 through 33, you'll find out why. When Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? This is Joseph talking to his brothers. You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. They wouldn't even eat with you. And if they're not going to eat with you, they're certainly not going to spend time. Hey, let's go to the movies together. Hey, let's, do something. No, so you're isolated. And then you find they were mistreated. In Exodus 1, verses 8 through 11, it says, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Well, really, were they too mighty? Well, there were a lot, but I don't know if they're too mighty. Verse 10, it says, come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. That's two things. They're going to fight against us or they're going to escape. So they're afraid. We don't want to keep you here because you might fight against us, but we don't want to let you go because we're enjoying this free slave labor. But in verse 11 it says, therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burden. Now, this is the condition of the Israelites at this time. And if that was your condition, what would you want? You'd want freedom, right? And that's what all of us would want. Nothing about this description says that life was great and it was something to be desired. Oh, yeah, this is what I want. Nobody wants this. That's why they're crying out to God for salvation. Now, remember these facts as we continue forward with the events that actually happened. So, we have deliverance at hand. In Exodus 13, verse 3, it says, then Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery, for by a strong hand the Lord brought you out from this place. What did they want? Freedom. What did they get? Freedom. Freedom from burdens, freedom from mistreatment. And who gave it to them? God did, by the strength of his own hand. So you would think you would remember that, right? I could remember that. And I could teach my children so that they could remember it. But it's amazing how fast people forget. But God tells them, hey, remember. Exodus 13, verses 8 through 10. You shall tell your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. And it shall be to you a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this statute at the appointed time from year to year. So they've been called to remember that God has heard your prayers for the call of freedom and has given you this freedom, and you should remember it. Now, I've said this in lessons before, and I'll say it again. We often misuse the memory that God has given us because what we remember and never want to give up is the bad things. When somebody's mistreated us, we want to dwell on it and we can't let it go. Well, I remember fifth grade, this person did this to me and I can't stand them to this day. That's how we are, right? But nothing in here does God say in the memory, hey, remember that. What God says is remember the good that I've done, that I brought you from this bad condition to this better condition. So you don't dwell on the bad, you focus on the good. And our memory should be focused on the good things. That's what God wants us to remember is the good things and how we're delivered and by whom. And in our lives today, we have lives full of sin before we were called by Christ. And we were in a mess. But God heard us. And we submitted to God and decided to join God's team. But how fast do we turn and say, well, maybe I did this for myself. Maybe it was coincidental. Maybe it was this. Maybe it was that. No, we know who we were delivered by. So we need to remember who we're delivered by. We need to get our priority in order. And this is a tough thing. But what God does is he established the first fruits belong to him because of who he is and what he's done for us. So if you look in Exodus 13, verses 11 through 12, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord. By the way, what is that word set apart? Sanctify, dedicated. Okay, so all these things that we use day to day just means they're set apart specifically for the Lord. And at the first opens of the womb, all the firstborn of your animals that are males shall be the Lord's. So guess what? God has always desired to have the first fruits. And why shouldn't he? He is God Almighty. We're people. He is deity. He's done good things for us. Why doesn't he get the best fruit? He wanted it back then, and he wants it now. I think sometimes we think about this, or maybe we don't think about this, and we say, oh, yeah, well, God wanted the first fruits back then, but, we're far in advance and future, and, I'll just give him what I spare change I have in my pocket. Well, that's not really first fruits. You might not have much, and God doesn't care about the amount. See, in the Old Testament, he had specific amounts. You tithe the 10. But under the new law, we don't have a specific amount. Because the new law is so much better than the old law, we should be glad givers. But we have conditions in life where sometimes maybe we can't give as much. That's why it talks at the first of the week. You think about it and you make a call to yourself and say, okay, this week has been, last week was really bad and I had a whole bunch of unexpected bills and I can't give as much. That's okay. You've made a conscious decision and you've dedicated what you could to serve God. Can you see the difference between that and saying, well, let me dig in my pockets and I have $2.38 here and that's what I'm going to give God? That is not priority. That's not making God first. That's not giving God first fruits. But when you say, I've looked at my condition and I'm going to sacrifice and give you this, that is putting God first. As a remembrance, we should never forget or lose our diligence in giving God his proper due. So, what is God's proper due? A lot of times we think, well, it's the money we give when we uh, contribute to the collection. Well, that's part of it. But God deserves our first fruits. And the first fruit is our hearts. Doesn't matter what I give in money, even if it's a great sum, if my heart isn't right toward God. My heart has to be right. And then after we give our hearts, are we dedicating time? Do I spend time in prayer talking to him? Do I spend time studying to learn more about him? And then comes our resources. The resources is the very last thing, but it's indicative of the first two things. Is your heart good? Is your time good? God's providing provision. God always provides for his people. And in Exodus 13, verses 17 through 18, it says, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. Well, why wouldn't God tell them to take the shortest route? Well, okay. It says, for God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. That God's a smart cookie. He understood what's going to happen. That all of a sudden they get out, they encounter conflict, and the first thing they're going to want to do is, oh, am I going to want to contend for the faith? No, I want to run to the condition I was in because that was comfortable. But in verse 18 it says, but God led the people around the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. So God took them the longer route so that they could avoid war. Is that not looking out for you? Yes. And he did that so they wouldn't be disheartened. And if you stop and think about things that are in your life, sometimes God puts hurdles in your path. Hey, don't do this. Let me put a hurdle in their path. And maybe they'll stop and think about it and go another direction, which is better for them. But if you're headstrong and just say, well, I'm just going to jump the hurdle, or I'm going to move the hurdle, or I'm going to go under the hurdle, or I'm going to go around the hurdle, however I'm going to do it, God doesn't stop anybody from doing what they want. And so you do these things. So we look around and say, well, why isn't my life a direct path? I've served God, I've committed to him, and why isn't everything just going smoothly in a direct path? But that's not how life is. If you think about a washing machine, they have what's called an agitator. And the new ones don't necessarily, but you understand what I'm saying. It gets in there and starts spinning around. But what does all that spinning motion do? When you take your clothes out, do they look like when they were put in? If you're working out in the yard and have dirt on them, mud, no, once you wash them, all that agitation motion does is clean them. I was talking about somebody and I said, hey, and I nicknamed her 98% because there's 2% I got to knock those burrs off, you know? And that's the whole point is that's what we need sometimes to get us clean, to get us knock those burrs off, to make smoother edges. That's why we don't always have the direct path. And if everything in life was so easy and so good all the time, you know what the first inclination of people would be? Why do I need heaven? Life here is so good. I never have any toil. I never have any tribulation. What do I need heaven for? Heaven is life on earth. No, it's not. No matter how good life is here, it's nothing compared to what's in heaven. And we need to understand that. Because we don't always see the big picture and all the implications associated with the big picture. You know, it's like looking through the door and you're looking through this lock and you can see a little bit, but you don't really know what's behind that door. You just have a kind of an idea. But God knows the beginning from the end. And God knows all of this stuff. And God knew they weren't ready to see conflict having just left captivity. You know, we've been captive for 430 years. We've been praying for a deliverer. Woe is us. Our heart is now overjoyed because we're free. And the first thing we come into is conflict. They weren't ready for that. And God knows it. So he sent them the long way. And sometimes that happens in our life. We do the long way and it's for our own good, but we just don't like it. I just want to get there. God's guidance. In Exodus 13, verses 21 through 22, it says, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light that they might travel by day and by night. And that should sound odd to you because did people travel in those days? Did people generally travel at night? No. It's not like they had lamp posts that they could see. And the streets weren't filled with, well, the streets sometimes had bad people out there and they were going to do things to you. This always reminds me of, when we did the run from Key Largo to Key West 100 miles and we had to run with a miner's light on. And it was fine during the day, but at nighttime, they have no street lights. You're going up 101 because that's the only road there is, and there's no street lights on it. So the only lights you can see is if a car's coming towards you, you get to see that light then, or if it's nothing, then it's just pitch black except for the miner's light. And it gets oppressive. But God didn't leave them in a situation where they couldn't see. Hey, you have a pillar of fire that you can see where you're going. And so it says the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from the people before the people. So they always had it with us. And here's the key fact that God never leaves his people to figure out what he asked you to do. Sometimes at work, your boss says, hey, can you do this? And you say, sure. Would you mind giving me a little parameters or something? And they say, no, just go figure it out. Go figure it out. That's not the way God operates. If God tells you to do something, he's helping you along the way to get to where you need to be. That's why God left us his word, the Bible. He didn't say, hey, seek me, but I'm not giving you any guidance. No, he said, seek me. And guess what? Let me give you this compilation of history and facts and miracles and people that you can refer to and understand how I am. In Jeremiah 10:23, you knew this had to come up at some point. But what does it say? I know, O Lord, that it is not in the way of man himself that he should what? Direct his own footsteps. If God left us to our own devices, we would never get to where we need to be because it's not within us to direct our own footsteps. We need somebody from outside to show us the way. We're just physical, and all we can see is physical. How can we guide ourselves to someplace we've never been spiritually? And the same is true of these guys. God told them about the promised land, flowing with milk and honey. Now tell me, how many of those people in this mass exodus had ever been to this place? Zero. So how are you going to know how to get there unless somebody shows you, unless somebody gives you a roadmap, unless somebody gives you some guidance? They're not going to know how to get there. They probably barely knew north, south, east, and west. They probably run around in circles and wind up in the same place, lost. But God doesn't leave us to figure out what we need to do. God gives us his word that we might seek him and know him. And we have the people's fear. In Exodus 14, verses 10 through 12, it says, when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. Now, I am not going to say anything about them having fear, because I would probably be in the same situation. If I were a captive for all those years, and I knew how they treated us, and we really didn't have any weapons, and here they come with chariots and weapons, I'd probably be a little fearful too. And so sometimes we get on people like, oh man, they shouldn't have any fear. I always love that we call Thomas Doubting Thomas. I'm like, how many times have you seen somebody come back to life? I've never seen it. So I would have some questions. I would like some evidence, and all he asked for was evidence, but we call him Doubting Thomas because of that. And here they're fearful. I'm not going to get on them about being fearful. The fear isn't the problem. It's what you do with that is the issue. So they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. And it's interesting because it says they cried out to the Lord. So it sounds good because they knew where salvation comes from, God. So let's cry out to God. And it sounded like they were going to seek his deliverance. But you read in verse 11, they said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Oh, I thought they called to God. I thought they were going to seek deliverance. No, they were calling to complain. And so they're complaining. And it says, what have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Verse 12. Is not this what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. Oh, so you enjoyed being mistreated. You enjoyed being subjugated. Huh, okay. If you enjoyed it so much, why were you crying out to God for salvation? It seems inconsistent. But they continue on, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptian than to die in the wilderness. Truth be told, it would be better to die in the wilderness than be a slave. But God had no plans for them to die in the wilderness. God didn't call you out to just kill you because God could have just left you there in that condition, or worse, as the title says, it can always be worse. Could have just let you die in those conditions. But he didn't. So they called to register their complaints. How soon they forgot that they weren't happy in Egypt. And after all that they had seen, the plagues and other things, they still refused to trust God. Fear makes people do and say dumb things. But even after God said God would get his glory on these people, not only did he say that, God said the people would never see these Egyptians again after this day. Oh, well, that sounds good. How are you going to do it? Tell me all the details. I don't believe it. I've got to know more. That's what the people are like. But God already told you, I'm going to get my glory, and you're never going to see these people again. But the people were fearful, and because of that, they come at Moses. And when you're coming at Moses, you're coming at God. How many times do we have these stories that we have to hear this? So It says, take charge. And in Exodus 14, verses 15 and 16, the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? This always makes me laugh when I hear things like this. And tell the people of Israel to go forward. And when I read this, I feel like I'm seeing God's sense of humor. You know, they've been crying to me this whole time to deliver them. I've delivered them. Why are you crying to me now? Guess what? The answer is in your hands, right? I've told you what you need to do. All you have to do is do it. Why are you crying? I've given you the answer and the tools to help yourself. So tell these people to go forward. Verse 16, it says, lift up the staff. Well, where's the staff? In his hand. And stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. So the lesson to us is move forward as we've been instructed. Don't let fear paralyze us to the point that we can't move. You know, you watch these movies, and I've never been in war, fortunately, but you see they're based off of true stories where a mortar round comes and somebody's just sitting there. But it doesn't have to be war. What do they teach you in swimming when you're trying to save somebody who's drowning? If they're flailing and attacking you, let them go. Otherwise, you're going down with them. People become fearful and they do just crazy things. And they refuse to move. And God's telling them, move forward. I've already got the plan. It's already laid out. You've got the answer in your hands. Trust me, is really what he's saying. Tell them to move forward. That's trust me. Don't you believe me? And when I say they believed, I meant the Egyptians. And it's funny because the Egyptians believed more than the Israelites. Why? Because they saw the evidence. In Exodus 14, verses 25, it says, the Egyptians said, let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. How is it that these foreign people who didn't even know God and didn't have a relationship with God could look out, see what's happening, and say, oh, we need to get out of here because God's fighting for them? Wow, that's impressive that they had that kind of belief. And yet, the children of Israel, less so. Verse 27 through 31, it says, and as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the hosts of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, through the waters, being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And at this point, I'll stop and tell you that I've had a curiosity since I was a little kid and watched the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston. That version was a good one. And they're coming through, and the walls of water's up, and everybody's going, part of me says, I might want to stick my hand in there. Maybe that's just me. But as you're walking down, and you see this wall of water to the right and to the left, and you're going through it, and you're looking, and all of a sudden, you see people coming, you're a little scared, right? And then God closes the water behind. Now, here's the question. You start seeing all those people getting tossed about in the water. You're like, I better move faster. I mean, so it's like, is the people in there going, I don't know if there's that kind of panic. I would be curious. That's one of the questions I'm always curious about. But I don't need to be curious because it goes beyond the story. The story is they all walked on dry land and they all made it safely. And none of the Egyptians did. So my curiosity just has to be just that. And in verse 31, it said that in verse 30, it says, thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Wow, that is impressive. It took all of that for you to believe. Yes. And only if the story would have stopped here, but it doesn't. So, how long do you think that belief would last? A month? 6 months? Well, how quickly they forget. In Exodus 15, verses 23 to 24, it says, Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. And they came to Marah, and they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, What shall we drink? 3 days? I mean, I get that you're thirsty. I would be thirsty. But 3 days? Again, here's the complaint. Well, what did you bring us out to kill us? You could have killed us back here. You could have killed us here. You could have killed us here. You know? No. At the first inconvenience, the people complain. And so the question is that how we are in life? We'll serve God as long as everything is going according to our plan and everything is good. But at the first sign of inconvenience, man, God, I didn't know I was going to have to suffer through any of this. God, this is just tough, man. Is that how we are? Did they really believe that God would save them from captivity just to kill them in the wilderness? Man, that thought is just so silly. If God really wanted them dead, like I said, he could have done it in Egypt. They could have been a footnote in history. And the question is, are we significantly different? At the first hardship in our lives, how do we react? Do we complain or do we trust God? So 3 days. 3 days is all it takes for them to start complaining. I don't have water. That's their most basic need. But God takes care of that. So we get even more complaints. In Exodus 16, verses 1 through 3, they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people. And by the way, so I moved on to Exodus 16. So the question is, did they die? Did they not get water? They got water, and they live. So they're going on in the Elim, and the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Zin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day in the second month, after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, What that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Oh, first we're complaining about water, now we're complaining about food. And here's the interesting part. It says they're complaining to Moses and Aaron. Well, Moses and Aaron are really just the vessel. They're really just the servant. So who are they really complaining about? Oh God, I'm complaining about the path that you're taking us. We sing a song that we'll go anywhere with Jesus, I'll safely go. Anywhere you lead me in this path below, over dread or wherever. Is that true? If our life gets dreadful, we're going to, well, maybe I don't need to sing that song. But here's the point. They were complaining about food. But we talk about revisionist history today, right? People look back and they say, oh, this didn't really happen this way. Oh, yes, it did. But people have to revise how things happen. And guess what? They're doing. So when we think about revisionist history and we hear it, don't act like it's new. This is exactly what they're doing. They're saying they're meat pots and they ate bread to the full. Really? Did they? Again, why were they praying to God for deliverance from this salvation if it was so great? And then comes the accusation. Oh, yeah, I know you saved us from the Egyptians. I know you gave us water. But now we're going to die of starvation. When does it ever stop? So I started out the story with it could always be worse. And nowhere in there did I really talk about it could be worse. But it could be. So if you turn your Bibles to Numbers 21, verses 4 through 6, it says, from Mount Hor they set out by the way of the Red Sea to go around to the land of Edom, and the people became impatient on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water. And then we loathe this worthless food. What do you mean there's no food, but you hate the food you have? Oh, okay. That's kind of like me. Sometimes people want to give me soup. I don't want soup. I want pizza. I want a hamburger. But it's still food, right? Soup is still a meal. So there you go. Don't complain about it. But we loathe this worthless food. So then the Lord sent fiery serpents amongst the people, and they bit the people so that many people of Israel died. And you're like, Warren, how can you conclude with this? It's terrible. God sent fiery serpents and they died. Yeah, okay. Well, some people think it's harsh that God sent fiery serpents, but he had given them water when there wasn't any, and he had given them food. This is their wake up call. You don't like what you're given? It can always be worse. Their complaints are baseless, but there's a simple solution to their plight. So while it sounds like we're ending on a low note, we're not. The note is when people are ungrateful, when people are accusatory, when people don't appreciate what God has done for them, it's going to get worse. It can always get worse. And that's it for their case. But even though it got worse, I didn't show you the following verses. But Moses had a solution from God to make a brazen serpent and to lift it up. And if anybody looked upon that, they would be saved. That sounds awfully familiar. What does that sound like? Well, does that sound like Jesus being lifted up? And if anybody looks upon him and submits, they too will be saved? Oh, wow. Interesting connection. So there was a simple solution to their plight. The first solution is don't complain. But you did. But the second solution to their plight was it still looked to God. Even after all that he did for you, this was a wake up call. All you had to do was look upon the salvation that God provided, and you would be saved. And those who looked upon that raised bronze serpent, which is the foreshadow of Jesus, they lived. So that's the lesson for us today is one, don't complain. But two, sometimes we do. But the point is we need to figure out how we can bolster our trust in God. That when things look like they're going awry, they're really not. God's in control. How do we learn to increase our trust? How do we learn to increase our faith? How do we learn to increase our belief that will get us through these situations? By looking to Jesus. With that, the lesson is yours. If anybody has a need, now's a convenient time while together we stand and sing.